Emily Hartman had always lived a quiet, ordinary life. Or at least that's what most folks in the small town of Cedar Grove, Oregon, thought about her. At 42 years old, Emily was the kind of woman whose gentle warmth made everyone around her feel at ease. She was soft-spoken, never imposing, and yet had a presence that drew people in. To her neighbors, she was simply a devoted mother, a loving wife to a brave firefighter, and a trusted friend who had once dedicated her career to helping others navigate the maze of mental health as a professional counselor. Cedar Grove itself was a place frozen in time, a town of just under 5,000 residents nestled among towering pines and winding mountain roads where Main Street still boasted an old-fashioned soda fountain, and the community gathered annually for the 4th of July parade, for the retirees who'd spent their entire lives here. Emily was a comforting figure, someone they'd watched grow from a thoughtful young girl into a compassionate woman whose smile never seemed forced and whose patience felt endless. But beneath that ordinary exterior, Emily carried secrets she had long struggled to conceal. From the earliest days of her childhood, Emily had felt a deep and unsettling connection to things unseen, things that the sensible adults in her life politely dismissed as imagination or dreams. When she was 8 years old, she woke in the middle of the night, her small heart racing, having just witnessed in vivid detail a terrible car accident involving her uncle. She had rushed to her mother's bedside, sobbing uncontrollably, begging her mother to believe that what she had dreamed was real. Hours later, when the phone call came bearing the tragic news, Emily's mother had looked at her daughter differently, not with suspicion or fear, but with a quiet recognition that her child possessed something neither fully understood nor entirely welcome in their conventional world. Emily's sensitivity extended beyond premonitions. She often found herself aware of whispering voices, soft murmurs at the edge of hearing, as if someone stood just beyond sight, trying to deliver a message she couldn't quite grasp. On other occasions, she sensed presences in empty rooms, feeling their energies brush against her skin like gentle fingers. Animals, too, seemed to seek her out. Stray cats appeared at her doorstep, wounded birds lingered near her garden, and the neighborhood dogs wagged their tails joyfully whenever she passed. Even as a teenager, Emily had understood that she was different. Her high school years had been spent balancing the complexities of adolescence with the constant effort of ignoring and suppressing her unusual abilities. Wanting desperately to be normal, she buried her intuitive gifts beneath layers of denial, reasoning, and rationalization. In her early 20s, seeking clarity and perhaps even redemption from what she believed to be unsettling experiences, Emily turned to her family's faith, becoming deeply involved in a conservative Christian church in Cedar Grove. For nearly 10 years, she committed herself wholeheartedly to religious teachings, trying desperately to align her unusual abilities with the rigid doctrines she studied. She attended Bible study regularly, volunteered for church outreach programs, and became a familiar face at the Sunday services held in the quaint, white chapel on Elm Street. She prayed earnestly every night, hoping God would take away the strange sensations, the premonitions, and the whispers that made her feel isolated and misunderstood. Her faith became both refuge and prison, providing comfort, but also reinforcing the guilt she felt whenever her abilities surfaced. But as the years passed, Emily began to feel stifled by the weight of living a life that no longer felt authentic. The whispers never stopped, nor did the gentle, intuitive nudges that guided her away from harm or toward moments of connection and healing with others. Her faith remained strong, but the strict doctrines and expectations of her church no longer resonated with the truth she carried deep within. At 38, after an especially vivid experience, a dream in which she conversed clearly and lovingly with her mother who had passed away from breast cancer decades earlier, Emily knew she could no longer pretend to be someone else. Slowly and with great care, she stepped away from the church community she had loved, knowing that this decision would invite criticism and misunderstanding. The loss was painful, yet it felt necessary. With newfound courage and support from her husband and children, Emily allowed herself to embrace the gifts she had fought for so long. Gradually, she began working part-time as a spiritual healer and intuitive counselor. Drawing from her years as a mental health therapist, she gently guided people through grief, anxiety, and trauma, offering them solace through practices that blended her natural intuitive abilities with meditation and mindful compassion. Word of her calming presence and uncanny ability to communicate silently with animals quickly spread through Cedar Grove. Local pet owners, especially elderly residents whose pets were their closest companions, would seek her advice when animals grew ill or unsettled. Emily would spend quiet afternoons sitting cross-legged on soft blankets, eyes closed, communicating silently with beloved dogs, cats, horses, and even birds, helping their owners understand what they could not speak aloud. By December, Emily had become a trusted figure in the community, not just as a mother, wife, or friend, but as someone whose very presence seemed to promise peace and understanding. Even those who once questioned her spiritual choices now greeted her warmly at the grocery store or stopped to chat at the post office. They might not fully understand or embrace her path, but they respected the authenticity with which she now lived her life. Her children thrived under her gentle guidance, and her husband, a proud and dedicated firefighter, who often witnessed life's harshest realities, found deep solace in Emily's quiet strength. Yet as Christmas Eve approached, Emily had no inkling of the dramatic shift that lay just ahead, a transformative event that would change her life and shape her destiny in ways she could never have imagined. But for now, as snow gently dusted Cedar Grove and holiday lights twinkled along quiet streets, Emily Hartman moved gracefully through the life she had finally come to embrace. Unaware that her greatest journey was about to begin, Christmas Eve in Cedar Grove was always something special, and the Hartman home on Maple Avenue was no exception. A fresh layer of snow, nearly 6 inches deep, blanketed the rooftops and lawns, glistening softly beneath the warm glow of colored holiday lights. Wreaths adorned front doors, and in living rooms across town, families gathered close, cherishing their time together. Inside the Hartman residence, the scent of cinnamon and pine needles filled the air, mingling with the warm, comforting aroma of roast turkey and sweet potatoes baking in the oven. Emily Hartman, now 42, moved gracefully through her modest kitchen, stirring gravy on the stove, humming quietly to herself as she watched snowflakes swirl gently past the kitchen window. Her husband, Matt, a broad-shouldered firefighter whose calm presence always put others at ease, had just returned home after an exhausting 24-hour shift at the local fire station. Emily knew he carried the heavy weight of responsibility from his job, especially in winter when fire hazards increased and harsh weather often turned simple emergencies into life-threatening situations. Their 2 children, Jack and Lily, ages 10 and 8, were seated in the cozy living room, their faces glowing with anticipation as they watched It's a Wonderful Life for what seemed like the 100th time. Emily smiled, savoring the familiar sounds of Jimmy Stewart's voice mingling with her children's laughter, creating the gentle harmony that had always defined their holiday tradition. She felt deeply grateful not only for her family and their comfortable home, but also for the peace she had found since embracing the intuitive gifts she'd once hidden. It had been a long journey, one filled with doubts and struggles, often overshadowed by the disapproval from those who couldn't understand her spiritual path. But tonight, as Christmas Eve wrapped its comforting arms around her home, Emily finally felt at peace. Dinner was perfect, a meal seasoned as much by joy and gratitude as by herbs and spices. Matt carved the turkey, sharing humorous anecdotes from the firehouse, while Jack and Lily excitedly talked about their wishes for Santa Claus. Outside, the snowstorm intensified, winds gusting upwards of 30 miles per hour, causing snow to pile rapidly on the streets and sidewalks, transforming Cedar Grove into a picturesque but challenging winter landscape. Despite the storm inside their home, all felt safe and warm. Emily cleared the dinner dishes, smiling softly as Matt gathered the children in front of the fireplace to read. 'Twas the night before Christmas, just as her mother had done decades before. As Emily placed the last plate into the dishwasher, a sudden sharp pain pierced through her head unlike anything she'd ever felt before. It came without warning, fierce and relentless, as though an invisible hand had driven an ice pick deep into her skull. Her vision blurred instantly, the room tilting violently. Clutching the edge of the granite countertop, Emily struggled desperately to steady herself. But her grip faltered, and in a terrifying moment she collapsed onto the kitchen floor. As darkness swept over her, she vaguely heard Matt's alarmed voice calling out her name, followed by the frightened cries of her children. Within minutes, Matt had dialed 911. The snowstorm, now near blizzard conditions, had rendered most roads impassable, and the dispatcher urgently informed him that no ambulance could safely reach their location. Matt's heart pounded furiously in his chest, his training as a firefighter kicking in as he tried desperately to stabilize Emily, whose breathing had grown shallow and uneven. After tense moments, a solution emerged. A medical evacuation helicopter would be dispatched from Portland, some 40 miles away. It was the only chance they had of getting Emily to a hospital quickly. The dispatcher warned him it would still take nearly half an hour, and every minute was critical. Matt wrapped his wife in blankets, talking softly to her as she lay unconscious on their kitchen floor, whispering words of encouragement and love. Jack and Lily stood trembling, tears streaming down their faces. Matt did his best to reassure them, fighting back his own panic as they waited for help to arrive. It felt like an eternity before the powerful hum of helicopter blades broke through the fierce howl of the wind, signaling the arrival of emergency help. Snow whipped violently as medics rushed into the house, quickly assessing Emily's critical condition and securing her onto a stretcher. Moments later, they carried her out into the storm, loading her into the waiting helicopter. Matt hugged Jack and Lily tightly, reassuring them through tears that their mother would be okay, praying desperately that he was right. Inside the helicopter, Emily drifted in and out of consciousness, hearing distant voices distorted by the roar of engines and wind. The pilot navigated carefully through the storm, visibility dangerously low, relying heavily on instruments as he fought the fierce, swirling gusts. Despite the skilled efforts of the medical crew, who constantly monitored her vital signs, Emily felt her consciousness slipping away. She no longer sensed fear or pain, only a gentle, enveloping sensation of release. As the first faint rays of Christmas morning pierced through the helicopter's windows, casting a golden glow across Emily's pale face, something within her shifted. With the rising sun came an inexplicable calmness, a feeling that transcended her physical state, as though the warmth and beauty of that first morning light had called forth her very soul. And then, effortlessly, Emily felt herself rise above the chaos of the moment. She saw the medical crew frantically working to stabilize her, their voices muted as though underwater. She observed her body lying still, peaceful and oddly distant, bathed in golden sunlight. Gently she drifted upward, passing through the roof of the helicopter, as though it were nothing more than mist. From this vantage point high above Cedar Grove and the storm now receding below, Emily experienced a profound peace she had never known. The snow-covered landscape stretched endlessly beneath her, glittering in pristine stillness. In that timeless moment, she understood that her journey on Earth had brought her to this very point, preparing her for something far beyond anything she had ever imagined. Emily Hartman had always known she was different, destined to see and feel things others couldn't. Now, suspended between worlds on a Christmas morning, touched by both tragedy and grace, she realized with absolute certainty that her true journey was only just beginning. The moment Emily Hartman crossed the veil between life and death, she knew with a depth beyond thought that she had entered a place not of imagination, but of eternal reality. There were no pearly gates or grand announcements. no thunderous voices or flashes of judgment. Instead, there was light, soft golden and alive. It shimmered like morning dew lit by the rising sun and blanketed everything in warmth deeper than any fire ever could. Emily didn't feel like she had traveled far, and yet the shift was so profound, so all-encompassing, that it rendered time, space, and memory irrelevant. One moment she had been lying in a helicopter, clinging to life as the world she knew spun away beneath her. The next, she was standing barefoot in a vast, otherworldly garden, more beautiful than anything she had ever seen or could have ever dared to dream. The air itself carried a pulse as if the atmosphere breathed with her. Around her stretched a landscape of unearthly peace, a meadow covered in flowers not known to earth, each one glowing faintly with its own inner light. Trees with silver bark and emerald leaves reached into skies the color of lapis and lavender, and a small brook wound its way through the garden, its waters humming a melody that felt both ancient and deeply personal. It was music without sound, like a memory she had forgotten she carried in her bones. There were no shadows in this place. The light came from everywhere and nowhere. It simply existed like love. Emily stepped forward, and to her surprise, her body felt whole. Not just healed from the stroke that had struck her down, but restored to an ideal version of itself, strong, vibrant, ageless. She could feel the soft grass under her feet warm like a summer morning in Oregon, even though no sun shone directly overhead, and in the distance, rising like golden mist, she began to see 3 figures approaching her. Not walking exactly, but moving with a grace that made the wind around them seem to bend and sing in their presence. They did not speak with mouths, and yet their arrival brought with it an overwhelming sense of recognition and peace, like coming home after a long, painful journey. The first was Leora. She appeared as a radiant woman clothed in a robe of soft amber light, her eyes wide with compassion. Emily felt a maternal love from her that nearly brought her to tears. It wasn't just kindness, it was knowing. Leora's presence wrapped around her like the embrace of a mother who had waited centuries to hold her child again. Without a word, Emily understood Leora had been with her for lifetimes, always watching, always guiding. Next came Malachi, towering and serene, exuding strength not of muscle but of spirit. His presence felt like standing before a great mountain, unshakable, wise, yet gentle. His skin shimmered like moonlight on still water, and when he looked at Emily, she felt her fears melt away. Malachi did not need to speak. His gaze alone assured her that every sorrow she had endured, every sleepless night, every whispered prayer and hidden tear had been seen, noted, and held close. Then came the third figure, the one who stirred something deep and ancient within her. The Watcher. Neither male nor female, human nor angel, a being of light and shadow, form and formlessness. The Watcher did not evoke comfort in the traditional sense, but awe, holy, reverent awe. Emily knew instinctively that this being had stood at the edge of worlds, witnessing the rise and fall of nations, galaxies, and souls. Yet it had come for her, to guide her, to remind her that her life, small and seemingly ordinary, mattered more than she had ever believed. The 3 did not move their lips. Instead, their thoughts entered Emily's mind directly, not as words, but as pure understanding. She learned more in that one timeless moment than she had in all her earthly years. They told her she was safe, that this place had many names, heaven, the beyond, the garden, but that the name did not matter. What mattered was that she had been expected and loved. "Am I dead?" she asked silently, still clutching fragments of earthly language. Leora smiled gently, her thoughts caressing Emily's heart. "You are not dead. You are between what Emily wondered aloud, between who you were and who you are meant to become." As Emily stood in their presence, she felt the weight of her earthly life begin to lift the regrets, the questions, the what-ifs. But curiously, it wasn't all erased. Instead, it was reframed. Through the presence of her guides, she saw how every moment of doubt, every decision she'd second-guessed, had led her to this moment. The missed opportunities, the nights she lay awake wondering if she had ruined her calling by leaving the church, the years she spent hiding her gifts. All of it had been part of a design more intricate than any human eye could see. Leora stepped forward and motioned with her hand. Instantly a vision unfurled before Emily like a tapestry made of light. She saw her own life not as a single timeline, but as a symphony of lives, other versions of herself, existing in other times, places, and cultures. She was a healer in ancient Greece, a midwife in a small village in 14th century Ireland, a teacher in a Buddhist monastery in Tibet, and each life, though different in context, echoed with the same purpose: to guide, to comfort, to awaken others. Her soul had always carried this calling. It had only worn different names and faces along the way. Tears welled up in her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming sense of wholeness. She wasn't just Emily Hartman, mother of two, wife of a firefighter, spiritual healer from a small Oregon town. She was part of something vast, an eternal story written across the stars and soil, flowing like that sacred brook at her feet. Malachi approached her then and without words invited her to touch the waters. As her fingers dipped into the stream, images flooded her mind, not only of her own past, but of those she had loved and lost. She saw her mother young and beautiful again, standing in a field of white lilies. Her eyes met Emily's, and though no words were exchanged, the message was clear. "I've never left you." A sob caught in Emily's throat as she saw Rusty, the loyal dog who had been her best friend during childhood, bounding through the grass with joyful abandon. He paused at her feet, tail wagging, before fading back into the light. It wasn't just reunion, it was restoration. Emily stood in the center of the garden, arms open, heart exposed. For the first time in her life, she felt completely seen, not judged, not misunderstood, but embraced for who she truly was. The watcher drifted closer, its presence more intense now, almost electric. A new understanding entered her mind, profound and urgent. This place was not just for comfort, it was for commission. She was here not only to remember, but to decide. And so came the question, would she stay or return? The garden shimmered, the colors pulsing with divine invitation. Emily could remain, they said. There would be no pain, no illness, no weight of a failing body. Her soul would merge into the great expanse of love that danced within every leaf, every ray of light. Or she could go back. Back to the storm. Back to the frail body in the ICU. Back to struggle, to loss, to a long, hard road of healing. And if she chose to return, she would not go alone. You were made for more. The voice of Malachi whispered, not in her ears, but in her soul. And they are not done needing you. The faces of her children flickered before her like beacons in the night. And Emily Hartman, with tears streaming down her radiant cheeks, made her choice. The moment Emily Hartman chose to stay just a little longer in the garden of light, time seemed to fold gently around her. There was no ticking clock, no sense of urgency, yet something within her stirred, drawing her forward through a subtle veil of golden mist. The guides, Leora, Malachi, and the Watcher had not vanished, but they stepped aside, their luminous forms becoming part of the living light that bathed the garden. It was an invitation, not a demand, a gentle beckoning towards something deeper. As she stepped beyond the trees with bark like silver lace and flowers that shimmered with colors she couldn't name, Emily began to sense others nearby. Not strangers, not spirits, in the vague, intangible way she had once feared as a child. But familiar presences, each one drawing her with a current of recognition, so strong, it stopped her breath. The air itself trembled with anticipation like the quiet hush just before a symphony begins. And then she saw her, standing in a field of softly swaying blue fireflowers just past a low ridge blanketed in lavender light, was a woman Emily hadn't seen in nearly 3 decades. Her mother. Not the pale, fragile woman whose life had faded under the relentless grip of cancer, but vibrant, whole, radiant. Her chestnut hair shone like polished oak in the golden light, and her hazel eyes sparkled with the joy of a soul no longer tethered by pain. She wore no crown, no robe, nothing regal, just a simple white sundress and bare feet in the grass. But to Emily she looked more glorious than any queen. Tears sprang instantly to her eyes as she broke into a run, her bare feet touching ground that pulsed softly with energy like the heartbeat of creation itself. She didn't care if it was a dream, or a vision, or a divine mirage. She only knew that when her mother opened her arms, she fell into them like a child, safe, small, and utterly loved. "Oh, Mama," Emily whispered, burying her face in the warm curve of her mother's neck. "I've missed you for so long." Her mother held her tightly, and though no words passed between them, Emily heard everything she needed to hear. "I've been with you through every moment. I never left." Memories came flooding back, sitting in the kitchen as a teenager talking about boys over hot cocoa, laughing under a blanket fort when she was 6. Her mother brushing her hair gently after a long day of school, even the hard times, the nights of grief, the whispered prayers, the aching silence of watching cancer consume the strongest woman she had ever known. All of it was suddenly filled with purpose. In this place, nothing was wasted. Not pain, not loss, not even death. As her mother slowly stepped back, her smile never faded. She motioned toward the horizon where another figure approached. Smaller this time. 4 legs, a wagging tail. Rusty. Emily gasped. The golden retriever who had been her constant companion from ages 5 to 12 came bounding toward her tongue, flopping eyes filled with the purest joy. He barked once, short, familiar, and enthusiastic, before jumping up into her arms. He felt exactly the same, the warmth of his fur, the weight of his body, the dampness of his nose pressed against her cheek. Emily collapsed into the grass, laughing and crying at once, hugging him as he rolled onto his back and kicked the air in excitement. "I thought I'd never see you again," she murmured, burying her face in his fur. Rusty didn't answer, of course, but his tail thumped steadily against the earth, and his eyes, oh, those eyes held the same loyal gaze that had watched her grow from child to teen. In that moment, Emily understood something profound. Love, true selfless love, didn't end with the body. It couldn't. It traveled with the soul, stitching lifetimes together like stars in a constellation. As the reunion ebbed into stillness, Emily felt another sensation rising within her, a pull. Not from the garden, not from the guides, but from herself. It was as though something deep inside her had awakened and was now demanding to be seen. Her surroundings shifted not jarringly, but like the graceful turn of a kaleidoscope. The light remained, but the landscape rearranged itself, and before her stood not people or animals, but reflections, versions of herself. The first figure appeared as a young woman, perhaps 20, dressed in a toga-like garment with copper jewelry and dark curls piled high upon her head. Her skin was tanned by Mediterranean sun, and she stood beside a clay altar surrounded by wild herbs and flowers. She was a healer. Emily saw it immediately, treating wounds with oils and prayer, her hands steady, her heart brave. She had lived in ancient Greece, and her name had been Thalia. Then came another, an older woman in a threadbare cloak, standing on a misty hillside. Her hands were weathered, her eyes wise. She was a midwife in Ireland during a time when childbirth was as much battle as blessing. Her name had been Mabe, and she had ushered hundreds of souls into the world, whispering lullabies and prayers as they drew their first breaths. Another self appeared, a serene woman seated cross-legged on a wooden floor wearing simple saffron robes. Her face was calm, her presence luminous. She had been a teacher in a Tibetan monastery, guiding others toward peace through silence and meditation. And then another, a nurse during the Civil War, tending to the wounded with hands that trembled not from fear, but from unrelenting compassion. One by one, these versions of Emily stood before her, and with each came a flood of memory. Not in detail, but in essence. She remembered the aching of feet, the sting of loss, the triumph of saving a life. She remembered looking up at the same moon through different eyes in different centuries, and always with the same longing to bring healing, to bring comfort, to bring light. She was not many souls. She was one soul with many expressions, and for the first time, she understood what her life on earth, this life, truly was the latest chapter in a far older story. The visions faded, folding gently into the soft glow of the garden once again. Emily stood still, overwhelmed but not afraid. She felt awe and deep gratitude. Everything had led her here, not only her own choices, but those of her ancestors, her other selves, and even the griefs she had once thought meaningless. All of it had shaped her. Leora appeared once more, stepping through the mist like sunlight breaking through morning fog. Her voice, still not a voice, but a knowing, whispered through Emily's heart. Now you see. You are more than you remember. But you have always been this. Emily fell to her knees, her hands pressing into the warm grass. She wasn't broken. She wasn't lost. She had been growing through every life, every moment, every heartbeat. And now, as the golden light pulsed around her, she felt the fullness of her soul. Loved, known, called. She wasn't meant to stay forever. But this holy glimpse was the remembering she needed. The remembering that would carry her home. Emily Hartman stood at the edge of the eternal garden, surrounded by the lingering echoes of every soul she'd ever loved, every life she'd ever lived. The peace was indescribable, not just the absence of fear or pain, but the presence of something so holy, so complete, that it seemed to sing through every blade of grass, every ripple in the air. She had reunited with her mother, embraced her beloved Rusty, and stood face to face with countless versions of herself, souls who had carried the same mission across centuries, to heal, to comfort, to awaken others to the truth of love that lives beyond time. Now standing barefoot in this realm of light with her spirit guides watching silently from the mist, Emily knew what came next. It wasn't an ending. It was a question, a choice, and it would demand everything. The Watcher appeared again, more radiant than before its form, impossible to fully comprehend, like light, draped in shadow and motion without shape. It didn't speak, but its presence communicated something so powerful that it rooted itself instantly in her chest. The time had come to decide. Not to prove herself, not to earn anything, but to choose between staying in this eternal place of peace or returning to the broken, trembling body that still lay in the ICU of a Portland hospital on Christmas morning. Emily didn't ask why the decision was hers to make. In this realm, such questions dissolved before they formed. Free will, she now understood, was not merely a human burden. It was a sacred trust. She felt the gravity of the choice, and though her soul longed to remain part of her, the part still tethered to a husband's steady love, and the wide eyes of 2 sleeping children began to stir. The guides did not pressure her. They didn't bribe or guilt. Instead, they revealed. Slowly, gently, like pages turning in a book she had once forgotten how to read. First, they showed her the path of staying. If she remained here, her soul would dissolve into the pure current of divine love, becoming part of the great yes behind all creation. Her essence would live on, not as Emily, but as the melody she had always carried woven into the lives of others, through comfort memory and spiritual presence. Jack and Lily would grow, Matt would find his footing again, and in time their grief would give way to a deeper understanding. She would be with them still, just not in the way they had known. Then the vision shifted. She saw her body weak and motionless in the ICU bed. Tubes and machines hummed quietly. A nurse adjusted a monitor. Matt sat nearby, his head bowed, holding one of her hands between his own. He looked like a man trying not to break. She saw Jack's drawing tucked beside her pillow, a picture of their family standing under a Christmas tree, his mother smiling with her arms open. She heard Lily's small voice in the hallway, asking her grandmother when Mommy would wake up, and then she saw something more. The guides opened a window in time, not just the present, but the future. If she chose to return, the path ahead would not be easy. She would wake paralyzed on one side. Her speech would be slurred. She would have to relearn everything, walking, talking, even writing. The first months would feel like drowning in her own skin. There would be moments when she would wish she hadn't come back. The physical pain, the isolation, the frustration of her once strong mind struggling to form the simplest sentence. But the vision didn't stop there. She saw herself 18 months later standing on a stage in a modest auditorium, wearing a long shawl and speaking with warmth to a room filled with people, many of them older, some holding canes or sitting in wheelchairs. She was telling them about this place, not to impress, not to convert, but to comfort. Her voice wasn't perfect, but it was strong. She was reading from her book titled The Garden Beyond the Light. The audience was rapt. Tears glistened in the eyes of strangers who had come with heavy hearts and left with hope. Then another vision, Emily guiding a grieving woman in her 50s through meditation, helping her connect with her late husband. A young veteran shaking in silence, finally reaching out after hearing Emily describe the peace she had found beyond the veil. A hospice nurse finding new strength in her work, no longer fearing death after hearing Emily's story. And then, most unexpectedly, she saw herself alone, in a forest, kneeling beside a fallen fawn. She closed her eyes, laid her hand gently on its side, and whispered something only the soul of the creature would understand. The animal stood unafraid and wandered off into the trees. Tears streamed down Emily's face. Returning would mean suffering, but it would also mean purpose. It would mean her children growing up, not just hearing stories of God's love, but watching it lived out in their mother's strength. It would mean that every scar, every limp, every pause between words would be a testimony, a message written not with ink, but with life. Leora stepped forward, then her form pulsing gently with empathy. Her gaze held Emily's, and this time words did form, just 5 of them. "It is not your time." Emily nodded, not because she felt obligated, but because she knew it was true. She had more to give, not because she was perfect, but because she had seen, and seeing had changed everything. Malachi placed a hand over her heart, and Emily felt a warmth radiate through her entire being. Not a physical warmth, but a spiritual imprint, like a seal pressed into the soul. The Watcher raised its hand, and a beam of light, thin as thread, strong as steel, connected Emily's spirit to the world below. The garden began to fade, not disappear, but soften like the final notes of a lullaby. Emily looked one last time at the meadow, the flowers, the trees that had welcomed her so fully. She would remember. She would carry this place inside her. And then she let go. She fell, not like falling from a great height, but like being lowered gently into water. The light dimmed, the warmth receded, and the hum of machines returned. Her breath hitched. Her eyelids fluttered. A single tear slid down her cheek. the room in the ICU filled with beeping movement and the hushed scramble of nurses. Matt gasped. "Emily." He choked, standing up so quickly he knocked over the chair. Her lips parted. She couldn't speak, but her eyes opened. And for the first time since Christmas Eve, she was home. Not just in her body, but in her purpose. Emily Hartman had chosen to return not for glory, not for ease, but for love. And as the ICU filled with shocked whispers and the word miracle passed from mouth to mouth, Emily lay still, her soul quietly bracing for the long road ahead, because she knew what few on earth ever truly grasp. Sometimes the hardest choice is the holiest one. The miracle didn't arrive with trumpets or lightning. It came quietly on a cold December morning as sunlight filtered through the frosted hospital windows, catching in the IV lines and casting a warm glow on Emily Hartman's face. Her eyes opened slowly, fluttering like the wings of a butterfly emerging from its cocoon. The nurses, who had grown used to the steady stillness of her body over the last 48 hours, froze. A single gasp from the charge nurse shattered the silence. "She's awake." But what no one saw, what no scan could capture, what no chart could explain, was the weight Emily carried as she returned. Behind her quiet eyes was a soul that had walked among gardens not of this world. A soul that had held the hands of spirit guides, knelt in fields of eternal light, spoken without speaking, and chosen suffering over serenity. She didn't come back to escape death. She came back because love called her home. And now, back in her fragile body, the pain struck fast and deep. The stroke had taken more than time. It had stolen ease, familiarity, function. Her right side was paralyzed. Her speech was slurred. Her thoughts came like echoes there, but distant, distorted. The first 3 days were a blur of tubes, charts, and whispered prayers. Doctors called her survival a statistical anomaly. One neurologist, shaking his head, mumbled, "Medically, she should not have come back." And yet there she was, breathing, blinking, staring intently at the world with the quiet urgency of someone who had seen beyond the veil. Matt never left her side. He wiped her brow with gentle hands and whispered their children's names into her ear like holy mantras. Jack and Lily were allowed brief visits, their small fingers curling around hers, their eyes wide and uncertain. Emily tried to smile for them. She couldn't speak, but the tears that rolled down her cheeks told them everything. She had come back. She was still their mom. And something about her, though quieter, slower, scarred, was more radiant than ever before. The days turned into weeks. Therapy began first painfully and then persistently. Her body, once lithe and capable, betrayed her. Tasks that once took seconds, buttoning a shirt, lifting a spoon, writing a note, became battlegrounds. Every muscle screamed, every joint rebelled. Her right hand curled into a stubborn fist. Her mouth refused to form words correctly. There were nights she lay awake, frustrated beyond measure, staring at the ceiling and wondering why she had chosen to return. Was it a mistake? Had she misheard the call? Had she imagined it all? The medications brought their own torment. Anti-seizure pills clouded her thoughts. Painkillers dulled not only the aches, but also the clarity she had brought back from beyond. Some nights the depression gripped her so tightly that she wanted to slip back into the darkness, to drift again into that field of flowers, into the arms of her mother, the wagging tail of Rusty, the glowing silence of peace. But each time that despair came close, something else, small, stubborn, sacred, rose up within her. A voice. Not loud, but true. You chose this. For them, for love, for light. 6 months crawled by, and then one day the shift began, not dramatic but undeniable. Emily was sitting in her wheelchair beside the hospital window, sketchpad in her lap. Her hand, still tremoring, moved clumsily across the paper. The lines were jagged. The proportions were wrong. But the colors, those were perfect. She was drawing the garden, the silver trees, the radiant stream, the fire flowers that pulsed like living stars. She didn't need to remember. The image was imprinted in her soul. It poured out of her like sunlight breaking through clouds. Soon sketching became therapy, not just for her hands, but for her mind, for her voice. Words began to follow, halting at first, then flowing slowly, like water melting its way through ice. With the help of a speech therapist and a notebook she kept by her bed, Emily began to record the things she had seen. Not to boast, not to convince, but because something inside her told her that others needed to know. This world is not all there is. Death is not the end, and love never loses its grip. At 9 months, she left the rehab center, still in a wheelchair, still needing help dressing and eating, but stronger, different. She moved back into her home now, outfitted with ramps and support bars. The town of Cedar Grove rallied around her, delivering meals, sending cards offering quiet encouragement. And something remarkable began to happen. People who had never spoken to Emily before, neighbors, old classmates, even strangers, started showing up at her door. Not to ask for healing, but to ask what she had seen. They came in ones and twos, sitting at her kitchen table, sometimes holding her hand, sometimes just staring through tears. One woman had lost her son in a car accident and hadn't smiled in a year. A retired teacher struggling with cancer. A man in his 60s whose wife had died of Alzheimer's. Emily didn't preach to them. She didn't offer a formula. She just listened. And when the time was right, she would say something quiet. Simple. You're not alone, even when it feels like you are. Or, I've seen what's waiting, and it's more beautiful than words. That was enough. By the end of the first year, Emily had written a small book, a mix of journal entries, sketches, memories, and reflections. She titled it, The Garden Beyond the Light. A local publisher picked it up, and though no one expected much, the response was overwhelming. Not because it was literary or profound, but because it was honest. Her story wasn't about perfection. It was about pain, choice, hope, and the sacred weight of coming back when you didn't have to. Emily began to speak at small gatherings, nursing homes, grief support groups, church basements. Her speech was still slow, her movements careful, but people leaned in. They wept, they hugged, they asked questions. She never claimed to have all the answers, but she always pointed them toward the same truth. There is more, and you are loved beyond your understanding. Perhaps the most moving part of her journey was the effect it had on her own family. Matt, once a man who had hidden his emotions behind jokes and service, began to open up. He spoke of prayer, of angels, of the night he thought he'd lost her and how he had felt something in the room whisper, "Not yet." Jack and Lily grew up not just with a mother who had survived, but with a daily reminder that life is sacred and love is eternal. They saw their mother struggle and rise, weep and reach, and they grew up grounded, open-hearted, and unafraid of mystery. Emily Hartman would never again be the woman she was before Christmas Eve, and she never wanted to be. The stroke had changed her. The choice had shaped her. But the light, that garden, that peace, that divine encounter, it lived in her now. In her drawings, in her halting voice, in the way she looked into another person's eyes and saw not their faults, but their eternal worth. And though she sometimes still wept in the quiet hours of the night, mourning the ease she had lost, she never regretted her decision, because she had chosen love, and love had chosen to work through her brokenness, not around it. She was not a preacher. She was not a prophet. She was a wounded woman, who had walked with eternity and come back to say you are not alone in the dark. The healing didn't come in a straight line. It came in circles, some wide, some narrow, some painful, and some unexpectedly beautiful. By the time Emily Hartman reached the second year after her near-death experience, the woman who had once been known as Cedar Grove's quiet, dependable counselor had transformed into something more, something deeper. She was no longer just Emily the mother or Emily the wife of the town's beloved firefighter. She was a survivor, yes, but more than that, she had become a vessel, a bridge between this world and the next. And her journey, though hard-won, had become a path of healing not only for herself, but for others seeking light in a world that sometimes felt impossibly dark. Her house, modest and weathered, became something of a refuge. People came to her not in large numbers, but in steady ones. They brought stories, burdens, questions. Emily never claimed to have special powers, and she certainly didn't pretend to be anyone's savior. She spoke slowly with care and listened with more heart than most people knew how to offer. Many arrived thinking they would hear a dramatic tale about heaven's gates and angels with trumpets. But instead they encountered something quieter, something truer. She spoke about the garden, about the silver trees and the light that had no source, about Leora and Malachi the Watcher and the voices that spoke not with words but with knowing. But what touched people the most wasn't the imagery, it was the honesty. Emily never hid the pain. She spoke of her body's rebellion, of relearning how to eat, walk, speak, of waking up drenched in sweat from dreams she couldn't explain, of staring into the mirror and seeing both the light of eternity and the weakness of mortality. Yet every time she shared these moments, there was hope behind her words, like a single candle burning through a winter storm. One afternoon, a woman named Grace came to visit. Grace had lost her husband of 50 years to Parkinson's. She was frail, with shaking hands, and eyes that held too much silence. She said very little, but Emily invited her to sit, and they drank tea together in the sunlight by the window. They didn't talk about heaven. They talked about the ache of absence, about mornings that feel too quiet. And slowly, gently, Grace began to cry. Not loud, but with a kind of release that came from feeling seen. Emily reached over, took her hand and said the words she had come to believe with all her heart. He's not gone. He's just ahead of you on the path. And there's more love waiting than you've ever known. Another day, Emily met with a young man named Jason, a former Marine struggling with PTSD. He'd heard about her book from a chaplain and drove nearly 4 hours just to see her. He was guarded at first, stiff and unsure. But when Emily described the overwhelming peace she had felt in that realm, the freedom from fear, the embrace of something holy, he leaned forward and whispered, "I've never known peace in my life." They sat in silence for a long while, and then Emily told him about the moment she saw herself not just as one life, but as many, each one shaped by purpose. Jason wept. Not because he understood, but because for the first time he felt like maybe he mattered. Emily began keeping a journal, not for publication, but for clarity. Each entry was like a prayer, a thread connecting her earthly experience with the divine truth she had touched. She wrote about the paradoxes, how her broken body had become a sacred vessel, how the most painful moments often came wrapped in meaning, how even the days that felt ordinary were laced with eternity. One entry read, "Some days I feel weak, like a child trying to lift a mountain. But then I remember the soul is stronger than the body. It's not the strength of muscles that brings healing. It's the strength of love." Her artwork evolved as well. The shaky lines of her early recovery gave way to more fluid strokes. She painted not just the garden, but also scenes from her life. The hospital bed, the first snowfall after her return, her daughter's hands holding hers. Paintings spoke when words could not. They began to sell quietly at first, then steadily. But Emily didn't keep the money. She donated it to hospice centers, grief programs, and organizations helping stroke survivors rebuild their lives. In time, her home wasn't enough. Invitations came from churches, spiritual centers, veterans groups, retirement communities. Her travel was limited, still navigating chronic fatigue and lingering stiffness. But wherever she went, something unusual happened. People didn't just listen. They opened. People who hadn't prayed in decades found themselves whispering prayers after hearing her speak. Those who feared death began to ask, not if there was more, but what that more might look like. Yet for all the impact she made in the world, it was the transformation within Emily herself that stood out the most. Her relationship with her own suffering had changed. She no longer saw it as punishment or loss, but as initiation, a doorway. Every tremble in her hand, every stumble as she walked, reminded her that the veil between the visible and invisible had been lifted, and she had been asked to carry a torch back through it. At night, long after the last visitor had gone and the children were tucked into bed, Emily often sat alone on the porch. She would close her eyes and breathe in the stillness. The wind would rustle the pine trees. A distant owl would call. And sometimes, just sometimes, she would feel the presence of Leora or Malachi near. Not with words, just peace. A whisper in her soul reminding her you are still on the path. And she was. She was on the path every time she hugged a widow, every time she helped a stranger speak to their grief instead of choking on it. Every time she forgave her own body for not being what it used to be, and chose to live anyway. Emily knew she wasn't done. The road ahead would still hold valleys. There would be more surgeries, more setbacks. Her body would age faster than she hoped. But none of that scared her now, because she had seen the end, and it was only the beginning. Her job until that day came again was simple: to walk others toward the light she had once touched. One step at a time. In her living room just above the mantel, she hung a framed quote she had written during her first year of recovery. It read, "I died and came back not to escape death, but to remind the living you are seen, you are known, and you are never ever alone." And in the quiet corners of America, especially among those in the autumn years of life, her story lived on, not because she had survived a stroke, but because she had walked through death, carried back the fragrance of heaven, and chosen every single day to share it with the world. Emily Hartman's story is not about death, it's about life, and what it means to truly live after standing at the edge of eternity. She wasn't famous. She didn't write best-selling books or command stages with grandeur. But in the quiet corners of small-town Oregon, in hospital rooms and kitchen tables, in whispered prayers and trembling hands, her light spread. The woman who once doubted her place in the world became a lighthouse for others navigating storms of grief, loss, illness, and fear. She didn't claim to have all the answers, only the memory of a garden where love was the language and light was the air. She returned with that memory etched into her soul, and she let it guide every breath, every stumble, every word she managed to form again. Her journey taught her and those who knew her that healing isn't the absence of pain, it's the presence of purpose in the middle of it. That holiness can dwell in the broken body. That eternity isn't a far-off promise, it's something that leaks into this world through kindness, courage, and quiet acts of compassion. In the end, Emily didn't become who she was in spite of her suffering, but because of it. The stroke didn't end her life. It uncovered it. And with every trembling hand, every halting word, every soul she comforted, she testified to a truth that transcends all religion, doctrine, and doubt. We are never alone. We are deeply loved, and we are all somehow being led home.